In 1788, the British began sending prisoners to Australia to alleviate their overcrowded prisons and as part of their strategy to start colonizing the land. Many of these men were not charged with serious offenses, and so after their sentence would be released and begin a new life. Other prisoners would only continue to misbehave, and the worst of these would be sent to the remote and brutal prison colonies in Tasmania. And the worst of these colonies was the Sarah Island prison, where the conditions and punishments were truly horrific. So much so that prisoners would make frequent escape attempts. But unfortunately, those who were successful were then faced with the harsh reality of the wild and uninhabited Tasmanian outback. And the things they had to do to survive here were perhaps more horrific than the prison itself. As always, viewer discretion is advised. There's a long-standing and mostly inaccurate joke that all Australians are descendants of criminals. And while it's true that the British sent many of its worst prisoners out that way, 80% of the people who immigrated to Australia in the 19th century went there by choice for a better life in a new land. Now with that said, that does still mean that 1 in 5 of the Europeans to set foot on Australian soil was a convicted criminal. Transportation, as this practice was known, was basically just a step down from the death penalty. Even though these criminals were rarely sent away for the rest of their lives, the sentence meant being crammed into prison hulks, which were these massive floating prisons made from a decommissioned ship. And this was how they waited for a boat to come and take them away. The conditions on these were dirty and overcrowded with very little food or water. Then once they were on board a proper ship on the way south, the living conditions weren't any better. And as they made the crossing, they also had the added risk of dying at sea. Many prisoners even passed from disease before ever making it to Australia. Then once they got there, life in the prison colonies could be tough as well. During their time there were 2 classes of prisoners. The first were the new prisoners and well-behaved prisoners who were looked after quite well with enough food to keep them going and a little freedom. These individuals would be given jobs to do and they'd be given a suitable role if they were a specialist and skilled in some profession. Otherwise, they'd be given work as a laborer. They still wouldn't earn any money and lived as little more than an indentured servant working to pay off their crime. But other than that, the worst punishment would be the distance from their loved ones. For many, this was hardly any stress at all. Often, they'd even use the skills they learned to get paid work in Australia after being released, deciding to stay there and start a new life. Not all of the convicts behaved themselves, however. This was the second class. If the prisoners caused trouble, the first form of discipline was to have their rations restricted or they might be confined to a cell at night. If they kept making things difficult, they'd lose their job and be put in a chain gang, which is where their ankles would be attached to other prisoners by irons. They'd also have their diets restricted to just 1 1/4 pounds of bread and 4 ounces of oatmeal per day with a bit of sugar in it. Chain gangs also got the most demanding, back-breaking work. And then if that still wasn't enough to keep them in line, they'd get locked away in a prison when they weren't working. And if they were really unlucky, that prison would be the Sarah Island prison in Macquarie Bay in Van Diemen's Land, which is now known as Tasmania. This bay is surrounded by some of Australia's most difficult terrain. And if you know anything about Australia, you know that means it's a terrifying landscape. Escaping across it is nearly impossible. To the west is the ocean, and then to the east are uninhabited mountain ranges, cliffs, gorges, and rivers that no sensible person would try to cross. Not to mention the massive rainforest filled with dangerous animals. It's also cold in the bay compared to most of the rest of Australia. Powerful winds hit the coast so often with such force, the prison had to build a barrier wall 2 feet thick and 26 feet high to deflect them. In the winter, it also snows, and most of the rest of the time, it rains. The ground is also so wet that most early farmers in that part of Tasmania chose livestock over crops. The land was just too soaked through to grow much of anything. The only place where that wasn't the case was Phillips Island, which is another island in the bay with some shelter from the wind and rain, but it's also tiny. That meant that food at the prison was restricted, and the chain gang prisoners ate almost nothing. And if you still misbehaved after getting there were some special punishments unique to Sarah Island. A repeat offender might be sent to a rocky outcropping off the shore to sleep out in the open. To get onto the rocks, they'd have to climb up onto them, which meant getting wet. So then they'd have the choice of a damp sleep or taking their clothes off entirely and sleeping naked in the cold wind and rain. But even that is not the worst of it. The worst offenders were flogged using what was known as a double cat o' nine tails. It had 9 leather strands similar to a normal whip, but they were twice as heavy as normal with twice as many knots that were also double the usual size. Getting flogged by one of these would put a person in the hospital for months. It shattered ribs and caused severe internal bleeding, as well as deep cuts and lacerations. And afterwards, the wounds would be washed with salt water, adding to the agony. But surprisingly, it was as brutal as it was ineffective. Getting flogged usually made prisoners desperate instead of better behaved. In fact, reports from the time claim that people whipped once were more likely to get whipped again. Some of the prisoners even went on to commit crimes that would get them the death penalty, so they would never have to go through it again. Others, like Alexander Pierce, would go on to plan their escape. All his life, Alexander Pierce couldn't seem to keep out of trouble. In 1819, when he was around 26, he was convicted of stealing 6 pairs of shoes and sentenced to be transported from his home in Ireland for 7 years. It was probably not his first offense, because the cost and time of transportation weren't usually used for something as simple as petty theft. So though there's no record, it's safe to assume Alex got into trouble most of his life. After sentencing, he spent 6 months in a hulk on the south side of Ireland. Then on October 3rd, 1819, he was packed onto a ship named the Castle Forbes with 140 other convicts heading to Port Jackson near Sydney, Australia. 166 days later, on January 27, 1820, they reached Australia and were promptly sent to Van Diemen's Land. Then finally on March 4th, he was disembarked and given his first work assignment. Alex didn't have a special trade though, so he was made a farm laborer in and around the Tasmanian island. This meant he had some freedom where he could work and be looked after, which should have been easy, but soon enough, Alex's behavior began to be a problem. Just 9 months into working with the farmer, he did his first stretch in a chain gang. It's not clear what he did, but he was given another chance shortly after. He then worked as a servant to a local constable for his next job, but again, 16 weeks later, he was back in the chain gang. Then in December, so almost a year after arriving, he got a new job on a sheep farm. This was also where he made his first attempt at escaping with 4 other prisoners. They even managed to stay free for 3 months before being sent back to prison. Unfortunately, getting captured seemed to only make Alex more eager to cause trouble. On May 18, 1821, he was given 50 lashes, confinement at night, and chain gang work for embezzling 2 turkeys and a duck. And he seemed to just continue this pattern, constantly going from easier jobs and then back to the chain gang. Eventually, this escalated, and Alex got involved in robberies and got arrested for being drunk and disorderly, stealing, and several other offenses. After which, in November of the same year, he was given 6 months in a chain gang. During this time as well, Alex had also been forging order forms to get a hold of items, maybe for trade or to use himself. In March of 1822, this fraud was discovered, and he ran away with 6 other prisoners for a second time, and he managed to stay free for another 4 months. When he was finally captured and convicted, he had all of his freedoms and privileges taken away, but worst of all, Alex had finally done enough to be sent to the opposite side of the island. You see, up until then, Alex had been landing himself back in the prison near Hobart, which is the most populated area. This time, he was taken to the remote and brutal Sarah Island prison, and he wouldn't be given another chance this time. At this point as well, he had 4 years left of his sentence. That would be 4 long years doing the most brutal, backbreaking work with very little food and the possibility of more lashes if he did something wrong. It looks like this possibility was too much for Alex to bear, because only a month later he would attempt to escape again, but this time things got a lot nastier. On September 20th, 1822, after arriving at the prison, Alex was one of several chain gang prisoners sent to the eastern shore of the harbor for a work assignment. Luckily for him, prior to his arrival, some other prisoners had been planning an escape attempt. It's not clear if Alex landed in the group by chance or if he'd found a way to work his way in, but either way, the men behind the scheme, Robert Greenhill and Matthew Travers, had a long history. They'd known each other back in Ireland since before they were convicted, and they'd tried to escape once before by stealing a small boat. This time, the plan was to use the work assignment to escape. Their job would be to cut timber that would be sold in the local towns. That meant leaving the island and going to the mainland, having your irons removed so you could work safely, and each man would be given a potentially deadly weapon, which was an axe. Now, just as a warning, the details of what happened next come from 4 confessions, all probably but not definitely given by Alex. And although they don't wander too far from a single narrative, they do have crucial differences. Alex gave the first of these confessions shortly after being captured in 1822, and it's usually thought that he gave this confession to one of the local magistrates, Reverend Knopwood, who oversaw his trial. And this confession is a strange piece of writing, flipping from third person to first person and reading more like someone took an official statement about what happened and turned it into a confession they asked Alex to sign. According to this confession, on the way to their work assignment, as the boat got closer to the shore, the prisoners jumped out before the guard could stop them, ran toward a hut where the workers were stationed, and threatened them with their axes. Then they took all the food in the cabin, extinguished their fire so no one could signal back to the prison, sank one of these 2 boats, and then took the other down the river. When they reached as far as Phillips Island, they landed across from it on the mainland, smashed their boat, and then hid the pieces. The men then headed inland, each carrying whatever they could toward a mountain. They arrived at the base around 3 p.m. and climbed over 2,500 feet toward it, and from there they could see the whole bay and the prison, and they wondered if the prison could also see them, so they kept hidden away in the brush. By the time they reached the top, it was late evening, so they lit fires and made themselves as comfortable as possible in the cold and damp weather. They also took turns keeping watch for any search parties while the others slept. In the morning, they carried on, trying to stay as high in the mountain ridges as possible. Then that evening, they stopped at a creek for water, ate some food, and made camp again for the night. Day 3 of the escape was when it became a struggle for all of them. The weather was just terrible with non-stop rain and freezing cold winds. These continued into the next day as they trudged through thick forest and occasionally crossed rivers, which soaked them even more than the constant rain. And when they could see ahead, it was foggy and difficult to figure out where they were going. On the plus side, Alex was sure they weren't being pursued anymore, which somewhat relieved the tension, but they were hungry and getting hungrier. That night, they found a barren hill, but at the top, they realized there were no trees ahead, just barren shrubland. That meant there was nothing to eat there. It was so empty, they couldn't even find so much as a lizard to catch and cook. They would eventually make camp for the night, and for the first time, some of the prisoners expressed that their decision to escape may have been a mistake. On day 5, the rain kept coming down and was more torrential than ever, and they hardly got anywhere. Eventually, they found a spot with some shelter where they decided to camp for a while and hoped the weather would pass. On day 7, the rain settled and the fog lifted, and they could make out a mountain in the distance known as Frenchman's Cap. Reaching it meant they were about 19 miles from where they'd left the water. Then once they got to the mountains, the area wasn't as barren anymore, so they cut trees, built barriers from the wind, and started a fire. On day 8, the weather was better again, but the bush was so thick it made it almost impossible to make any progress. They decided the best way to keep going was to take turns going ahead with an axe to cut a path. While doing this, to keep tabs on each other, because they were spread out, they'd call out from time to time, but at some point, somehow, 3 of the prisoners disappeared. Rather than worry that they might have been left behind, the others were worried they'd given up and were instead on their way back to let the guards know where they were to try to get some leniency for their escape attempt. So rather than go back and look for them, they increased their speed through the dense bushes. On day 10, the rain came down hard again, and the remaining 4 men were desperate to find any sign of people. Despite the weather though, they crossed another set of mountains, then they found a river on day 11 and camped beside it overnight. The next day, the men who could swim helped those who couldn't get over the river. By then as well, their shoes had worn out and walking was painful. They were also hungry, cold, and wet, and they began to slow down, managing only 4 or 5 miles on days 13 and 14. Then on day 15, they reached another larger river. Because they hadn't eaten for days, there was just no way they could cross. They didn't have the strength. This is when someone in the group had an idea. Alex claims, at least in this first confession, that the group came up with the idea together, but obviously someone must have suggested it first. What the group had decided was that it might be better to sacrifice one man so the others could survive by eating him. And apparently they were all so hungry and desperate that they decided this was a good idea. They then drew straws, and a man named Thomas Bodenham drew the short straw. According to Alex, he didn't panic or beg, he only asked to be allowed to pray and ask God for forgiveness for his crimes. Then they sent 2 of the group off to collect wood, knowing they wouldn't like what was about to happen. Alex claims that Robert then took his axe and struck Thomas on the head, instantly taking his life. And the reason Robert was chosen for this task was because, according to Alex, he was the only one of them who'd killed before. Then Robert took out his knife and removed the edible portions that the others cooked on the fire. And according to Alex once again, how easy all this seemed to be for Robert was unsettling and made the rest of them uncomfortable. Either way, for the next 8 days they continued making their way through the bush with their new source of food keeping them alive. But soon enough, this began to run out too. Eventually they reached a valley with fern roots growing around a small stream, and one of the men, John Mathers, thought this might be a good food source. He scoured the valley for the youngest roots he could, managed to get a fire going, and then boiled some of the roots. After letting it simmer for a while, he ate some of it, and these turned out to be completely inedible, and John began to heave and then threw up everything he'd eaten. And then, according to Alex, Robert struck John in the head with his axe. This somehow wasn't a fatal blow, and John then managed to wrest the axe from Robert's hands. Incredibly, John restrained himself and instead of retaliating, only insisted that Robert shouldn't be allowed anywhere near the axe again, which was unanimously agreed to by the others. Later that day, John confided in Alex that he thought Robert and Matthew, given their prior history, would stick together and were just looking for the right moment to attack again. and that he and Alex should watch out for one another. Horrifyingly, 2 days later, maybe because he wanted to side himself with the strongest people in the group, a starving Alex decided that Robert and Matthew were the better chance of survival. One evening, one of the three of them pretended to be gathering wood and moved close to John. Then, before he could stop them, they pinned him to the ground, took the axe, and this time they were successful. Afterward, Robert found excuses to justify what they'd done. He said they were probably close to a town, and he didn't think that John would have kept quiet about what had happened to Thomas. So not only did they have the strength to reach salvation thanks to the additional food, but they also saved themselves from the gallows. They all agreed with this sentiment, and with newfound strength they carried on, although Alex, admittedly, was still a little bit worried about Robert. 4 days after they'd taken John's life, a venomous snake bit Matthew on the leg while they were walking. They didn't immediately know it was venomous until his leg swelled up, making it so painful to walk that he couldn't go any further. Matthew then told the others to go on without him because between the hunger and the worsening bite, he was sure his end was near. And he, like John, just wanted to pray and try to find forgiveness before he died, but Robert refused to go. Matthew was the only person Robert cared about, and he wasn't going to leave his friend to die. They would end up staying with him for 5 more days, and Robert did all he could. He fed him, brought him water, and tried to make him comfortable, but Matthew was in severe pain and his condition was worsening. Alex, on the other hand, partly because he thought Matthew had no chance of surviving, but mainly because the food they had was running out, wanted to end Matthew's life. But Robert wouldn't even entertain the idea. This wasn't just some convict he'd managed to escape with. This is a man he'd known all the way back in Ireland. On day 6 after he'd been bitten, Robert decided they'd try to keep going and just take Matthew with them. But if the walk had been difficult before, it was nearly impossible with the extra weight. Later that day, Matthew fell asleep while they were taking a moment to rest, and while he was out, Alex again brought up whether it was right to keep Matthew alive. While they discussed this, Matthew woke up for a second from the excruciating pain in his leg. He screamed out in agony for a moment and then fell unconscious again. And this was finally enough to convince Robert, and he could no longer leave his friend in that much pain. One of them then took the axe and finished him off. Afterward, as with the others, they made a fire and ate some of their new food and stayed in the spot for a couple days to regain their strength. 3 days later, they made their way up a ridge of some mountains to see if they could see any sign of people. They were sure there had to be some settlement somewhere, but they were wrong. There was nothing but more plains. It was just an endless expanse without a single town or road in sight. But then they spotted what they thought might be a path made by livestock. They went toward it, but unfortunately, when they got closer, it was clearly a natural formation in the landscape. Over this period of time, Alex was increasingly suspicious of Robert. With their food gone, it seemed like it might only be a matter of time. Because of this, at night, Alex positioned himself in such a way that if Robert came for him, he'd hear him coming. And it was a good job he did. Half asleep one night, he heard the axe being lifted off the ground. Alex then pretended to wake up and Robert backed off, but his intentions were abundantly clear. From that point on, Alex knew he had to get a hold of the axe. It was him or Robert. The problem was that Robert kept it close to him during the day and slept with it under his head at night, making it hard to get to. But eventually, one night, Alex managed to creep over and slowly slid the axe out from under his head before using it on him. Robert was finally dead and Alex was on his own. Alex then took some rations and continued his walk across the plains. Sometime between November 8th and 15th, so a minimum of 49 days since they escaped, Alex stumbled across a flock of sheep. By sheer luck, this was the farm of the shepherd he was taken in by while working as a laborer months ago. The shepherd didn't even recognize him at first. He was filthy, his beard was long, his clothes were torn so severely he was almost naked, and he was so thin he looked like a skeleton. But after a short confrontation, the man realized it was Alex and offered to help him. After 5 days in his care, Alex thanked the shepherd and then, stocked with supplies, made his way down the road to another man he knew in the area. He'd built this man's hut 6 months earlier while still a prisoner. This man was part of a small enterprise and he invited Alex to join him. Alex then spent the next 2 months working with him as a bushranger, which was really just a clever name for a sheep stealer. And then because of this, he was arrested on January 18th, 1823 near Jericho. By then, he'd been on the run for 113 days and he'd made it almost the entire distance across the island. So that is the first version of the events. Alex's second version might not have even come from him. It's claimed he made this confession while he was in the prison hospital after he'd been captured and sent back. And he apparently told this story to one of the prison officials, and it was written in the prison's record books. Unfortunately, those are likely lost to time, so all we have are 2 slightly different sources, both of which come from minutes of a deposition given to the British House of Commons by an assistant surgeon who claims to have been there when Alex confessed. In this second story, Robert is the villain right from the beginning. In this version, a different man was the first to be killed after Robert suggests him because the man had supposedly volunteered to be one of the prisoner floggers. In this version as well, it was Robert who introduced the subject of cannibalism. He claimed he'd seen it done before and that it tasted like pork. Another key difference in this version is that Robert had no issue killing Matthew. It was even Robert who told Alex to do it. Now, whether this was a genuine confession or not, the author, whoever it was trying to put as much blame on Robert as possible. Then, a third confession supposedly took place while Alex was waiting to be executed. The jailkeeper was said to be the one who Alex told this new version of events. This time, it's less harsh on Robert again. Like in the original confession, the first death was a group decision. Straws were drawn, and Thomas was the first to go. But Matthew, not Robert, is the one who took his life. John was also killed after drawing straws, but he wasn't ambushed like in the original version. Then, like the second confession as well, Robert suggested Alex finish Matthew off to end his suffering. In this version, it seems more like a mercy killing than an act of evil. Either way, Alex confessed, or so it seems, a fourth and final time. This final confession was one that a reverend delivered to the crowd at Alex's execution. The reverend claimed he'd just gotten the version from Alex moments earlier, so Alex had no reason to lie. And during this, Alex also confessed to another crime. In this final version, Thomas was the first to die, but it was told as if he didn't have much choice. The group apparently ganged up on him, and after it was done, they were all forced to eat some so that none of them could claim to be innocent. And the rest of this confession is more or less similar to the first confession. The truth is probably somewhere in between, and especially difficult to discern given how long ago it was and the available information. However, the story isn't over, and this next part may change your mind about which version of the events you think is most likely. This is because it wasn't that first escape attempt that led Alex to the gallows. After being captured, Alex was sent back to Sarah Island to await trial, and he probably knew his chances of returning to Ireland anytime soon were low. Still, he settled back into his routine of working in the chain gangs. He had the same job as before, chopping wood on the mainland, but this time his ankle iron stayed firmly on and he was attached to another man. On November 13, 1823, he was sent to work on shore and chained to another man named Thomas. He usually shared his leg iron with Thomas, and despite being linked together, Thomas was eager for them to escape. According to Alex, Thomas knew he'd managed to escape once, so he constantly begged him to run away with him, but Alex refused. Then, when Thomas showed Alex he'd smuggled some fish hooks, a knife, and some burnt rags for lighting fires out of the jail, Alex decided it was time to make another attempt. When their guard was out of sight for a brief moment, the two ran for it, each carrying their axes. They then spent 3 days wandering around the area, reaching a river known as King's River on the 16th. At that point, they were roughly 10 miles from where they'd run. Soldiers were also out looking for them this time, so they waited for 3 days hiding in the woods. Then at some point, some sort of argument took place. They were hungry and hadn't made much ground, and the argument made Alex so angry that he decided to take Thomas's life. Then, once again, he ate his companion. As you might have noticed, this was becoming almost a habit. He stayed there for the rest of the day and that night before deciding to simply go back to turn himself in. This was his second escape from Sarah Island and his fourth escape attempt overall, and it would also be his last escape. Alex was convicted of the murder of Thomas and hanged at 9 a.m. on July 19, 1824. Afterward, he was taken away and dissected in the belief that they might find some physical reason for why he'd become a cannibal. His skull was eventually bought by an American phrenologist, Dr. Samuel George Morton, who was certain the lumps and bumps would explain why he did what he did. His skull is now at the Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. So after hearing everything, which version seems more likely? Was Alex hiding something deep within him that drew out a cannibalistic tendency, or was it just a coincidence? Was cannibalism just a means to survive on both occasions? I'd be curious to hear your thoughts down in the comments. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the form found in the description, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.